Thanks so much, Professor Radhika Desai, for joining the Red Nation podcast. There's a lot to discuss. But before we kind of jump into this conversation, do you want to maybe just introduce yourself to listeners? I know who you are. I've listened to your podcast. We met in Venezuela years back.
Yeah, sure. My name is Radhika Desai. I teach political studies at the University of Manitoba. I essentially write about and teach about a range of things, but the politics of certain countries I'm interested in, including the UK, India, the US to some extent, and so on, and then also about political economy. And some years ago, I introduced a new way of looking at world affairs, which I call geopolitical economy, because I find that most of the dominant ways of looking at world affairs, such as US hegemony or globalization, tend to imagine that the whole world is sort of a single, seamless whole, economically unified whole in which nation states and governments don't matter. They're an annoying interference in a free play of markets. And of course, this needs to be not only contested, but its implications need to be incorporated into how we understand world affairs. So that's me.
Yeah, and there's a lot to get it. There's a lot to unpack just even in those statements. I think even how we think about capitalism, typically in the West, it's often just framed as a sort of a struggle of classes. But as your work demonstrates over and over again, also entails a struggle amongst nations. So this gets to my first question. You have studied capitalism for decades as part of your research. So at the outset, I would like to lay out some basic points of the discussion by defining some terms we throw around a bit. Specifically, I'm thinking about the term neoliberalism and its various stages, or its various usages. Can you provide our listeners with the simplest way of thinking about our current era of capitalism and its most prominent features, since much of your work analyzes how neoliberal capitalism has operated around the world, and now that has reached a kind of historical endpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, as you know, you wanted to do this podcast after I wrote my most recent book, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy. And a central argument, I would say even the central argument of the book, although there are many, but this is pretty key to it, is to precisely understand neoliberalism, because my argument is that part of the reason why we have our countries perform so badly vis-a-vis the pandemic, why we are mired in this kind of war, which we are conducting, is a proxy war against Russia, and why we are destabilizing the whole of the world, the world order, basically, has to do with neoliberal financialized capitalism. This is the term I use, and I argue that it is most fully developed in two countries in particular, namely the United States and the United Kingdom, where the ills of neoliberalism have gone the furthest. So what do we mean by neoliberalism? And I'll come to financialization later, but what do we mean by neoliberalism? So basically, so in general, neoliberalism is understood to be about free markets and free trade. So the idea is that neoliberalism advocates free markets and free trade. It is the ideology with which about 40 years ago, politicians like Ronald Reagan, Mrs. Thatcher, etc., came to power. They said that the problem in the world, the reason why we had a big downturn and a big recession, a stagflationist crisis of the 1970s, was because the government was interfering too much in the economy. It was important to roll back this interference and so on. And of course, by talking what they were referring to when they said governments were interfering too much in the economy was they were referring to the post-Second World War order of what are generally known as Keynesian welfare states. So after the Second World War, we had welfare. Most Western countries had welfare states. They heavily regulated capitalism. They imposed capital controls. There was substantial state ownership. Economies were managed to try to at least approach to full employment, etc., etc. So this was the case, and the neoliberalism was then about rolling back all of these and giving freedom to capital in order that it will sort of, the idea was that if you remove these restrictions, then capital would be free. So neoliberalism is supposed to be about free markets. But what people have scholars have argued is that if you look back at what has really happened, when you talk about, free markets and competition, in reality, what has happened is, in fact, neoliberalism have not freed markets. What they have done is they have essentially freed capital, and they have freed not just ordinary, what most people consider capitalism, which is a whole lot of competitive firms and so on, but rather they have freed giant monopoly corporations. So, and that also relates to why neoliberalism has not actually done what it says on the tin. That is to say, they have not revived the economies of the Western world. And what has happened over the last 40 years is that giving monopoly capital these kinds of freedoms has not restored the productive health of our economies. Because in general, neoliberalism refers to competitive markets. But we don't have competitive markets anymore. We have an economy which is dominated by big giant corporations who are not price takers, as we might say. They are price makers. So they have absolutely no need to respond to the pressures of competition and so on. So applying the neoliberal recipe to this kind of economy has not restored productive dynamism. And the only thing it has achieved is the financialization of these economies. You give capital freedom, they have no need to invest. They make more, and the profits that they make are not reinvested. So they productively reinvested. So all they do is they slosh around in this vast sea of money capital, in which basically you don't invest to produce things in order to sell them and then make profits out of it, but you simply want to make more money out of the money you have. So without particularly producing anything, Marx would say that Marx argued that the circuit of capital is you start with money, then you invest it, you buy commodities, you invest, and then you produce more new commodities which are worth more than you sell them, so you get at the end more money than you had. Well, this is completely short-circuiting that process, and it is going from money to money without producing anything. So that's financialization. So what I'm arguing is that neoliberalism, and I guess I'll say one other thing. So as an ideology, neoliberalism has, you can say neoliberalism really emerged more or less with the birth of what we know as neoclassical economics, most of whose wings were actually very free market. There was perhaps one wing, the Walrasian wing, which was not necessarily free market, but the bias was definitely towards free market. So it emerged in the late 19th century, but already by the early 20th century, you had massive critiques of neoliberalism. Keynes was, of course, the most important. So through most of the 20th century, you had the dominance not of this neoclassical economics so much as Keynesian economics. And then it's only after the crisis of the 70s and the onset of neoliberalism that this kind of free market, free trade mantra really got its historical moment. It was, embraced by policymakers, and it still remains, despite the fact that over 40 years, it has not achieved what it's supposed to achieve. Our governments have still clung to it. And the key for that, to understanding that, is that neoliberalism is not a theory, it's an ideology, and it's an ideology which favors big corporations who are very powerful. They can always find people who will come to power and implement the policies that give them more and more freedom, tax them less and less, and so on.
And one of the sort of the way this manifests isn't just like in debates between economists. It actually, this is the 50th anniversary of the Chilean coup and the overthrow of Allende, and you and I were both in Caracas, and we went to the foreign ministry, and we saw, Allende's glasses on display. And it was a reminder to Hugo Chavez that they're not going to do to the Bolivarian project what they did to the Chilean project. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think most people have this conception of imperialism as when one country invades another country, or there's sort of military competition, or, we just don't like communists or we just don't like left projects, or that these people are dictators. What is the, you said a neoliberalism is an ideology, and how does that ideology manifest in sort of foreign intervention?
Actually, that's a really brilliant question, because what it does is it focuses attention both on how Chile was one of the, in fact, the first kind of experiment in neoliberalism, but also why it was so. So let's begin with the first. So, neoliberalism as an ideology, like I said, through most of the post-Second World War period, it was sort of sidelined because the dominant persuasion was Keynesianism, and governments thought that, they could use Keynesian economics and so on. And it was not that governments, they did this out of the kindness of their heart. The fact of the matter is that in the post-Second World War period, working class movements were very strong. They had mobilized over a whole century. They had acquired, of course, exceptional power during the wars, because if you want to ask people to go and fight for you, you have to promise them something. So in that sense, that was that empowerment. But neoliberalism sort of continued its existence at a subterranean level in these marginalized think tanks and so on. And in particular, by the early 70s, people like Milton Friedman in the University of Chicago were beginning to push it more and more energetically, particularly because the crisis of capitalism was upon the world. And so this was the opening through which they would sort of come through. So the coup against Allende in Chile was, of course, it was against a social democratic, some would say socialist government. So that makes sense. The United States is fighting communism everywhere, and we'll come back to that in a second. But the coup in Chile was essentially, as everybody now knows, as people like John Pilger have recorded in wonderful documentaries, that the USA was definitely behind it. They encouraged the coup. And it wasn't just that they wanted a government to take power, but they wanted the Pinochet government to implement neoliberal policies. Now, why do they want to implement neoliberal policies? Was it because Allende was a communist? I think really in order to understand the Cold War, the opposition to communism, you really have to put it in the larger history of imperialism. What do I mean by that? So basically, and by the way, some version of free markets and free trade has been the dominant ideology of most countries. So in the 19th century, when Britain was the most powerful country, it advocated free trade to everyone, right? Now, why is that? It's not that Britain always scrupulously practiced free trade. That is not it. It wants other countries to practice free trade. Why? Because essentially what imperialism needs and wants, apart from controlling societies and so on, what is the purpose of controlling societies, ruling them and so on? It is really to open up these societies to the interests, to capitalist interests from first world countries, from the imperialist countries. And this is very important to understand. You want to open up these societies. You don't want them to do what is really necessary, which is to practice various forms of protection and state direction in order to develop your economies. Because in the history of capitalism, we know that actually, contrary to the idea of free trade, the only way in which countries have developed is by actually not opening up, but at least selectively closing. We're not talking about autarky, but selectively closing your national economy, regulating the inflow and outflow of trade, inflow and outflow of capital, in order that you can develop your economy. Because if you simply open up your economy, what happens is that goods from elsewhere, which are produced more cheaply, simply flood your markets. Your own enterprises don't get a chance to produce and so on. And in the end, it doesn't work really for everybody. But imperialism always wants to open up economies, which is why some version of free trade has always been the dominant ideology. And this is why they wanted to impose that on Chile, because the Allende government had other ideas. They had the temerity to think that they could run the Chilean economy in the interest of ordinary Chilean people, and to try to develop their productive capacity and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the purpose of neoliberalism, so the Cold War, anti-communism, so to understand that is where you have to understand that if governments must always intervene to develop their economies, as was seen, for example, in the development of countries like Germany or Japan, or even the United States in its early days, practiced massive state intervention in order to develop, because if they had not, the dominant country of that time was Britain, and British goods would have simply flooded all markets and not allowed those countries to develop. But by the early 20th century, you also began to see the emergence with the Bolshevik Revolution of communist attempts to develop the economy, so that, in Russia, it was not possible to allow capitalism to do it as it was in Germany or Japan or the US. So you now saw an alternative way of development, which also involved massive state intervention, and which, by the way, was stupendously successful. By the end of the 1930s, Russia had already become the second most industrial country in the world. So imagine that, and this was done without the privilege of imperialism. This was done even though most of the capitalist countries were trying to oppose Russia's industrialization. And of course, today we see that in the case of China. So I would say that the whole purpose of it, so essentially the anti-communism of the Cold War was also a form of imperialism. The point was that countries should not try to develop in this way. The examples of Russia and China should not be imitated by other countries. So the Cold War itself should be seen as a chapter in the longer history of imperialism.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. And you've written quite extensively on how the neoliberal era has been defined by the unrivaled dominance of the U.S. dollar, and today it's very common to, even in the sort of the kind of bourgeois financial times, you hear the sort of decline of the U.S. dollar. But you've been talking about this for a long time, and this is evident in your 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy. Can you just provide an overview of U.S. dollar hegemony and dominance, and what sets it apart from, you mentioned earlier, say countries like China and its current positioning of itself to use the yuan as an international trade?
Yeah, so let me just begin with the dollar. I'll come to the yuan much later. So basically, when I started writing Geopolitical Economy, I thought I would use the idea of U.S. hegemony to criticize the idea of globalization. So I thought, I was always skeptical of the idea of globalization because I felt that it discounted the role of nation states. But then I thought, at that time, because, the kind of scholars that have written about U.S. hegemony are very good, very erudite. So I thought, okay, this is the way to criticize this stuff I want to criticize. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the idea of U.S. hegemony really doesn't hold water. And what's more, I realized that that what the U.S. has tried to do. So it's less of the idea is the reason why the idea of U.S. hegemony doesn't hold water is because the way in which the United States has tried to organize its hegemony is primarily by imposing the dollar on the world. In fact, even that, I came to that idea a little bit later, because once I began investigating how do you operationalize the idea of U.S. hegemony, I started reading into it, and I realized that there are as many definitions of U.S. hegemony as there are writers. So the point is that nobody agrees. Everybody has their own convenient definition, and then they each have their own very convenient view, and there's an entire industry of people who are talking up U.S. hegemony. The U.S. is great, it's the military, it's the dollar, it's the U.S. structural power, it's soft power, it's this, that, and the other. So then I began to read the history, where does this idea come from? And I realized that this idea itself is an attempt to dress up an ambition that U.S. policymakers began nursing as early as the early 20th century. So already before the First World War, or around that time, the U.S. could see that British power was waning, and they saw that now that they were emerging as a very powerful economy and so on, they felt that they wanted to try to replace Britain as the managing segment, as they thought of it, as of the world economy. And in particular, they said that they thought they would replace the sterling with the dollar, and London with New York as the world's financial center. So that was the goal right from the beginning. And in my book, Geopolitical Economy, I tell some really interesting stories about how they tried this after the First World War, but they failed. And then after the Second World War, they succeeded after a fashion. I put this in heavy quotation marks, the success, because one of my arguments is that there has been no such thing as U.S. hegemony, only repeated attempts to try to establish it. So the reason they, quote unquote, succeeded after the Second World War is that they, at Bretton Woods, when the world gathered to try to devise some means of, devise the main foundations of international economic governance in particular, the Keynes went there, John Maynard Keynes went there with the plan of creating an artificial, creating a multilaterally agreed world currency, which would not be used by you and me to buy groceries or a car or what have you. It would be used only by central banks to settle imbalances among them, while our countries would continue using their national currencies. But essentially, the United States nixed this plan. They said, no way, leaving the world with no alternative but to use the dollar. Because, US discourse in particular has naturalized the idea that the currency of the most powerful country can be the currency of the world, should be the currency of the world. But in reality, and they said, look, earlier it was sterling, now it's the dollar. So they are the ones who have created this discourse of, successive hegemonies, and now the US is a successor to Britain and so on. In reality, sterling was not a national currency. Sterling was an imperial currency. The only reason why the sterling system could work was because Britain had a vast empire and this is where, for people who are anti-imperialist, this is very important. What it did, the way the sterling system worked, people think it worked because the sterling was rolled back. Gold was just a backing. It just measured the value of sterling. The real foundation of the sterling system was this. Britain essentially extracted vast surpluses from her non-settler colonies, so colonies like British India, like Africa, the Caribbean. These surpluses were extracted, the populations were heavily exploited, etc. And these countries were massively underdeveloped in the process. And then these surpluses were exported as capital exports to Europe and to Britain's settler colonies, so like the United States, of course, US was no longer a settler colony, but it had been one. So United States, Canada, Australia, etc. So, and that is why the period of sterling dominance from the late 19th century onwards was essentially the period of the rapid industrialization of these countries, of Europe and these other countries. So this was the capital export. This is how sterling worked. Now, the United States said, okay, we want to emulate British-style dominance, but they said, but we can't, of course, we cannot today acquire an empire the size of Britain's empire. Britain's empire was going to go anyway. So they said, but we will just try to make the dollar the world's money and New York the world's financial center, completely forgetting that this rested on empire. So if the United States could not provide the world with liquidity, with dollars by exporting capital, which it could not because it didn't have an empire, it began to, after the Second World War, providing the world with liquidity by running deficits. Now, this method of providing the world with liquidity had already a big problem, which an economist called Robert Triffin pointed out back in the 50s. He said, look, folks, if this way of providing the world with liquidity has a problem, because the bigger the deficits, the less the dollar will be attractive to the world. So there will be downward pressure on the value of the dollar. People will not want to hold dollars. And indeed, that is exactly what happened, in the sense that the Europeans, because at that time the dollar was linked to gold at the price of $45 an ounce, the Europeans, who at that time were the main country that had an export surplus with the US, they said, look, we don't want your dollars, give us gold instead. So all the gold that the United States had stockpiled over the wars, the gold from the rest of the world had gone to the US, particularly from Europe, because it was safer during the wars and so on. All of this gold was drained out. And there was no gold backing for the gold. The US tried various things. It created a gold pool of other countries' gold and so on to continue to back the dollar with gold in the 1960s. But in the end, none of this worked, and the dollar's link to gold was broken. And so here's the final set of points. After 1971, you see, when the dollar's link to gold was broken, people thought, okay, this will be the end of the dollar. In fact, there was even a committee of 20 which was organized in order to try to come up with an alternative system, but eventually these talks went nowhere. So people say, well, look, everybody thought the dollar's role would be gone, but the dollar has continued to be the world's currency. But what this ignores is how the dollar has continued to be the world's currency. The way in which I argue in geopolitical economy this had happened is that the United States essentially has engineered since 1971 a series of what I call financializations in the plural, not singular, which is to say a series of expansions of purely financial activity, whether it is lending to the third world or stock market bubbles or housing and credit bubbles and so on. So you create a sort of, essentially open a giant casino in which you invite the rest of the world to participate merely in order to make financial profits, not productive profits. And this this creates an artificial financial demand for the dollar, which has no productive role to play. In fact, it strangulates production, but it buoys up, it counteracts the downward pressure of that Triffin had pointed to, and it creates demand for the dollar and creates, therefore, upward pressure on the dollar. So thereby somehow, to some extent, stabilizing the value of the dollar. But of course, each of these financializations has ended very badly. It has had a lot of victims among third world countries, among ordinary people in the United States and elsewhere. Like the Eurozone crisis, all of these are ultimately connected to these financializations. So today, I would argue, and this is where I have actually a lecture I'm going to put on the internet very soon, in which I showed that, a lot of the de-dollarization discourse that is taking place right now, it focuses on the alternatives that are emerging. And this is not untrue. They are emerging. China is emerging as a major source of finance. Countries are increasingly agreeing to trade in one another's currency, bypassing the dollar system, because the US has started weaponizing the dollar. In fact, it had always to some extent done so, but this is now becoming much more clear. So it starts doing that. But I also argue, so these alternatives are important and interesting, but I also argue that the de-dollarization process has another foundation as well, which is the internal contradictions of the dollar system. So today, that internal contradiction has emerged in the form of inflation. There is inflation means that the value of the dollar will decline. In order to counteract that, the Federal Reserve has had to start raising interest rates. Of course, one should oppose the raising of interest rates because it extracts a price on productive activity. But there is another aspect which people are not paying attention to, which is that the Federal Reserve itself does not want to raise interest rates very much. Remember, in the past, Paul Volcker allowed them to go up to 18%. Today, we are at a little above 5%, and the Federal Reserve is still saying, maybe not, etc. And the reason for that is that since the beginning of the 21st century, the Federal Reserve has pursued a low interest rate policy. And the last time it deviated from the low interest rate policy in the middle of the 2000s, it was these interest rate increases constituted the needle that pricked the bubbles of the credit and housing bubbles. And so we got the 2008 financial crisis. Today, the sheer wealth that depends on low interest rates is even larger. And the Federal Reserve is so its Federal Reserve is caught in a bind. If it continues to raise interest rates, it will break this bubble, harming the very people it actually owes its allegiance to, not ordinary people in the United States. But if it does not do that, inflation itself will undermine the value of this. So today I would say that the contradictions of the dollar system are mounting, massive. Oh, and so then the final point about the yuan, I will say, is that you see the yuan will be increasingly used in the international system. But I would say that and I don't think the Chinese will do this. There is a whole debate, when people look at, especially American scholars, they look at the yuan and they say, well, there's a big problem with the yuan replacing the dollar as the world's money. And they say that either the government of China is unwilling or it is unable to internationalize the renminbi in the way in which the dollar has been internationalized. Now, the problem with this argument is, of course, that the renminbi is being internationalized to some extent, but the real problem with this thing is that, in fact, if the rest of the world, including China, wish to replace the dollar with something else, precisely for the reasons that I have just said, which is that the national currency of one country cannot easily be the currency of the world. Precisely for that reason, what they should be exploring is the possibility of going back to something like what Keynes had proposed, a sort of artificial currency to balance trade, to pay off imbalances internationally, multilaterally agreed currency, rather than to internationalize the renminbi, because while to some extent the renminbi can be internationalized, if it is internationalized on the model of the dollar, it will actually destroy China's productive economy, much in the way in which the financializations of the recent past have destroyed the United States' productive economy. Because today everybody's talking about industrial policy in the United States. U.S. industry has been undermined in the neoliberal era. And so the real solution to the problems of the dollar is actually to go back to the drawing board and devise something, an updated version of what Keynes had proposed.
I want to return to some of these points that more so in the present, but I want to go back to something you said. And when you were talking about how Canada and the United States were no longer settler colonies of Britain, I wonder if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on how you understand settler colonialism in the context of global imperialism, because oftentimes we think of the United States as declaring independence of Great Britain, but it was geographically a very small kind of sliver hugging the Atlantic coast, and eventually expanded over time, competed with other empires such as the French and the British Empire for land, for resources, for trade agreements, specifically with indigenous people. To kind of fast forward a little bit, some of the most historic resistance, especially in places like Canada, has been led by indigenous nations, like collectively, not just individuals. And some of that has articulated itself as, sort of very kind of a distinct class, formation in relation to extractive capitalism, saying that, you're coming in and, either transporting or extracting raw materials from our lands, and we get no benefit from it, but we get all the risks, the kind of side effects of environmental catastrophe leading that. And I was wondering how, if you've thought about that in your work, because I think oftentimes in the States and in Canada, it kind of gets subsumed within, worker struggles. And, it's actually true, Native people are workers. They are part of unions. They've, in some instances, they've predominated in certain sectors than others. But at the same time, they're also sort of fetishized in a cultural sense, in saying that, like, they kind of exist outside of this kind of, worker boss binary, or this kind of imperialist system.
Well, I mean, that's a lot of questions. So if I miss some of them, do prompt me again. So first of all, I should say that settler colonialism, there is a lot of confusion around this. And that's why in the history of imperialism, one has always to distinguish between settler colonies and non-settler colonies, such as I said, British India or Africa, or most of the Caribbean. And the reason for that is that on the whole, what has happened, and I'm not talking for British Britain's settler colonies, and to, I suppose, France's settler colonies, basically Quebec and a few other islands dotted around the world. But on the whole, we're talking about British settler colonialism. So I would argue that British settler colonialism, first of all, created a group of countries, whether or not they are formally independent of Britain or not. I don't think it matters. The United States, in that sense, is not necessarily distinct from Canada or Australia or what. I mean, but essentially, it created a set of countries that, although they may not themselves have been imperialist, I'll come back to the United States in a second, but they occupied a favorable niche within the imperial system because they were the beneficiaries of British colonialism over non-settler colonies, the extraction of surpluses, and the import of capital into their own economies, and all sorts of other privileges that they got. Also, of course, they were the beneficiaries of being able to import cheap raw materials that came from other countries' colonies, and so on. So in that sense, and their people had the freedom to go and invest elsewhere and trade, all of these things. So in that sense, that's the first point I want to make. Secondly, coming to the United States, people often say, people in the United States love to say, well, we are not an empire, we don't have colonies, etc., which is, again, not strictly speaking true, because as Daniel Eberwar has pointed out in a recent book called How to Hide an Empire, actually, the United States has a lot of colonies, which... like Hawaii, for example, or Puerto Rico, and many other such colonies. So, as I was saying, the United States has all these colonies, so in that sense, it's not really a non-colonial. But a number of critical American historians actually see the process of the expansion of the westward expansion of the United States as a process of internal colonization, as some of you may be well aware. So this process of internal colonization continued all the way until about 1870, when the U.S. essentially reached the Pacific coast. And it was only then that it began to look, 1890s, pardon me. And only then, when it began to look for other colonies, it realized that the rest of the world had kind of more or less been accounted for by other countries, and therefore it could not really acquire a territorial empire anymore in that sense. And so, so in that sense, I think that the indigenous struggles that you're referring to, and also, of course, the struggles of other peoples in the United States, Black people, Latino people, etc. These are all, I mean, in a certain sense, the United States, in that sense, especially in the neoliberal period, has gone back to being ruled more or less as an empire, where the welfare of ordinary citizens seems to be largely absent from the national agenda, beyond sort of managing resistance and opposition. So I would say that, in that sense, the indigenous struggles now, you see, in Canada and the US, of course, are similar in one sense. They have both taken over lands of indigenous people, but the process has been a little different in Canada, where it was less of a kind of exterminist type of thing, where in the United States, the indigenous population, which was actually larger compared to the indigenous populations of the territory we today call Canada, but they were systematically exterminated. So today, as a proportion of the American population, the indigenous population is relatively low, whereas in Canada, it is a little higher. It's like maybe 4-5%, and it is rising today. And I think part of the reason is because in Canada, we got sort of, colonialism on the cheap, in the sense that the British simply said, yes, and, we agree with some treaties or whatever, we agree to respect you, etc. But these treaties were not fully respected, and they were, nevertheless, these kind of treaties were made, and now they are being honored only in the breach. And so we have this indigenous resistance and so on. So in Canada, by the way, the whole question of indigenous land ownership is actually a very material economic issue, because like the United States, Canada also relies a lot on extraction and agriculture, and therefore land-based activities. So in that sense, the indigenous demand for their own land is very important and has the potential to destabilize a lot of economic activity in Canada, because if how can you open a vast mining operation if you don't have rights to the land, or logging, or for that matter? So there is a lot of focus in Canada on the land issue where indigenous peoples are concerned. But I would say that that tends to leave out the struggles of indigenous peoples, which, as you rightly point out, many of whom are integrated into the labor force. So they have constituted. It's not, so to me, when Marx talks about primitive accumulation, that is to say, separating people from the land, which is something that happened in the Scottish enclosures, but also happened on a huge scale in the settler colonies in particular, where indigenous populations were displaced and so on, and put on smaller pieces of land called reserves, following which, of course, is a system that South Africa began to practice in the post-Second World War period as well. So this kind of system, so when Marx talked about primitive accumulation, or rather original accumulation, as he called it in German, this original accumulation was always about two things. One was to take land away, which is what everybody focuses on, but the other was to create a landless proletariat, which would have, a group of people or vast masses of people who had no option but to work for other people, because their access to their livelihood, which is the land, which every people that we have known in history had some original attachment to some or the other piece of land, and there may have been wars over it, etc., but it was there, and this has been broken, and we now take it for granted that if you open a factory, that somehow people will come and work for you. But this was not necessarily a given. If people had access to alternative means of livelihood and you weren't offering a better one, why should people come and work for you? So this compulsion to work for others is only created by this process of dispossession, as you may call it, and that was also, of course, that was the purpose of settler colonialism. So yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add to this, just for listeners, and I've wrestled with this question a lot, because I think one of the more I guess insightful texts that I've read and I teach is called Empire's Tracks, and it's by Manu Karuga, who actually tracks westward expansion and uses Lenin's theory of imperialism to understand, he's studying, he's not just studying trains, but he's studying like railroad expansion and the investment that happens. And it's it's a very modern, capitalist kind of enterprise. It's not to say that the indigenous resistance to it is, somehow like they're Bolsheviks, but it does sort of understand that this is kind of a process of primitive accumulation, and it's confronting capital, and that's how indigenous nations are sort of made in relation to the United States, and we're currently positioned. And I think there's I've heard you say this in other sort of interviews and podcasts about how this sort of postmodern kind of focus on just culture, sort of the culture of settler colonialism, the culture of imperialism, tends to kind of miss this economic side. And that goes, both ways in terms of how resources are extracted, but then also how people are put into and forced to sell their labor, within a capitalist system. I will say that, some indigenous nations in the past and presently have tried to sort of de-link themselves from these kinds of economies with various success and failure. The Navajo Nation tried to nationalize its natural resources, uranium, oil, and gas, and it ended in a sort of Senate-sponsored coup against the president at the time. So it was like kind of a mini, sort of deposing of, very, very similar. And actually around that same time period, I think it happened in the early 80s. So you do have these sort of alternative paths that are being, sort of drawn out and attempted in these projects. And I want to talk a little bit. Oh, I guess the final point on that I want to say is, in British Columbia, and this is worth studying, is British Columbia is not treated at all. Canada has no sort of legal foundation in British Columbia, and Indigenous nations have sought alternative economic partnerships with countries like China, or we just did an interview with Native Hawaiian activists who are saying, how dare the United States come in and say who our friends and enemies are? Our entire islands are militarized with military bases, expecting us to be the front lines of some kind of great powers conflict. And the same goes with Guam, which is seen as sort of an island aircraft carrier, sort of buttressing or sort of containing China. But I also wanted to sort of ask you a little bit about how does that work in terms of your theories of imperialism when we think about this sort of contradiction of how the United States is so dependent on China in terms of its economy, and other sort of imperialist powers are so dependent on China for its economy, but yet have militarily surrounded it. And it's like, what are when they're policing ship lanes, when they're surveilling ship lanes with this AUKUS agreement, it's like, what are these ships carrying? They're carrying goods to San Francisco. They're carrying goods to Vancouver. So how do we make sense of this sort of contradictory move where on one hand it's like we're anti-China and we want to subvert the sort of Chinese economy, and we're going to militarize the shipping lanes, build military bases completely surrounding and containing China, while at the same time depending on it economically to produce the consumer goods that we need for our economies.
This is such a critical part of what happened during the period of neoliberalism. We were talking earlier about neoliberalism, and I was pointing out that one of the consequences of neoliberalism was financialization and the productive weakening, especially of the US economy. I think this is less true, say, of Europe or Japan, but especially of the US economy. And this is very much bound up with China. So let me explain. Basically, what you began to see after Nixon's visit to China, and then the recognition of China, and then increasingly the opening up, particularly in the 1990s, of a U.S. trade with China, and then a little bit of investment and so on. What you began, and then China's access into the WTO, etc., all of these things, the United States engaged in all of these things on the assumption that increasing engagement with China will essentially create for the United States a kind of practically like a colony, in the sense that China would continue to liberalize its economy, which means open up. Remember, liberalization is stepping back of state intervention. The state no longer acts in a developmental capacity in China as it had done until then. So the idea was that that increasing engagement with China would essentially turn China into a vast pool of labor producing cheap goods for the United States. So the United States, of course, United States corporations made China one of their major destinations, the major destination of U.S. foreign direct investment. But I would like to qualify also or point out that foreign direct investment, that is American companies investing in China, this was actually is relatively small part of the way in which the Chinese have become producers for the United States. Bulk of the production takes place through outsourcing, which does not involve investment. Essentially, the investment is made by Chinese companies. They develop the productive capacity and then they produce to sell to this or that American corporation, whether it's Walmart or what have you. So this type of outsourcing in which the companies are owned by the Chinese, this is the main way in which Chinese have become major producers for the United States economy. But nevertheless, this kind of interaction became quite deep and intense. And in the early 2000s, people began to talk about Chimerica, as though it is a single country. But you see, what became very clear in the 2000s, and especially after 2008, after the crisis of 2008, is that China had no intention of remaining a subordinate producer of cheap, low-value goods. In fact, China was inching its way up the value chain, producing more and more sophisticated goods, first for its own vast market, and then later for other markets. And then the Chinese, and especially after 2008, the Chinese government, the West suffered a huge crisis. The United States suffered a huge crisis, the so-called Great Recession. And so on, out of which, by the way, we have still not emerged. I mean, to some extent, it has continued. And on top of that, now we have new crises layered on top of that. China, meanwhile, after 2008, of course, it suffered a very sharp trade shock, but it was very short. It sort of trade dipped and then it recovered, and the rest of the world went on as before. And what China did is it showed that the Chinese government could essentially turn on a dime to replace the stimulus of exports, which was substantially lost, not completely, but quite substantially lost. The Chinese government first initiated a massive investment. And then after that had done its work, it also has since then allowed wages to rise, creating a large market for China itself. So today, for example, the Chinese government's official strategy is what they call dual circulation. That is to say, China produces not just for export markets. And by the way, China's dependence on export markets has always been exaggerated. China also has a vast economy. China is ruled by the party state, which is committed to bettering the standards of life of their own people. So, of course, domestic consumption will remain important anyway. But it has now also been explicitly sort of recognized that we have dual circulation now. We will export as well as expand the domestic market. And so this is the way in which China is developing. And so beginning with the Obama administration, once the realization began to sink in that China is not going to be your low-cost producer, etc., the hostility to China has been increasing. Obama executed the so-called pivot to Asia. Of course, Trump came to power, essentially blaming China for all of the ills of the United States, which are entirely homegrown. China is not stopping the United States from reviving its productive economy. The United States government is not committed to doing so because that's not what the big corporations want. Big corporations don't give a whit about, how many people are employed, what's the quality and quantity of jobs, whether people have enough houses, etc., whether they're indebted. Nobody cares about them. So this is the whole issue. So since that time, now we have a situation in which China's technological leadership is becoming quite threatening to the United States and its big corporations. And let me just say a couple of things, two things in particular. Number one, there is an outfit called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI for short. It is a hugely anti-China outfit. And they have published a report which says that China is leading in some 37 out of 44 technological areas. Okay. So it's basically raising the alarm that, the Chinese are going to take over, we've got to do something, etc., etc. Of course, nothing will get done, but this is the reality. That's what they are saying. The second point I wanted to make is that, you see, increasingly today in the United States, the Biden administration is talking about industrial policy. People are praising Bidenomics, the Inflation Reduction Act, blah, blah, etc., which contain elements of industrial policy. That is to say, a conscious state policy to try to revitalize industry and so on. But in reality, given the kind of political structure we have in the United States, which is that we basically, in the US elections bring to power governments that essentially are geared to do the bidding of the big corporations. So the United States does not exist to control corporations, which is what effective industrial policy would require, but it is rather controlled by the big corporations. So the effect of this is very interesting. The United States, we are told, is a formidable military power. It spends nearly $1 trillion on its military every year, which is more than the next couple of dozen states combined, depending on which year you're looking at it, the number changes. So you'd think that the United States would be very effective militarily, but no. The fact of the matter is that the United States has not won a single war on its own in its history, apart from overrunning tiny countries like Grenada or Panama. It's never really won any war. It had to accept stalemate in Vietnam. In Korea was defeated in Vietnam. We have all these, the ignominious withdrawals from Afghanistan has been a little bit erased by the current conflict in Ukraine. But all the US's arms and equipment are not going to win Ukraine this war either. So the United States is going to have a lot of pie on face by the time this is over. And the Biden administration is simply trying to ensure that it is not over, at least until the next elections are done. So that the pie on face won't be there until after the election. So now, and what's more, so you fund your military-industrial complex to this extent, but you can't win a war. And what's more, now the Russians and the Chinese have weapons that are technologically far more sophisticated than what the United States has. So, for example, hypersonic missiles are the one thing that come to mind, but there are probably other such things as well. So what I'm trying to say is that this is the result of neoliberalism coddling the big corporations. All this military spending is not to make the United States a more effective military power. It is simply to coddle U.S. corporations who use the U.S. State as a source of risk-free profits, essentially. So this is what you have in the U.S. So to come back to China, the reason why the United States is flexing its muscle at China is that it is hopping mad, that the Chinese have the temerity to actually become technologically and economically competing power. The United States is hopping mad, but it does not really have any means to deal with it. The best way the U.S. as a people, as the United States as ordinary, the strategy that will be in the greatest interest of ordinary people in the United States is actually to make peace with China, with Russia, with the whole world, and accept that other countries will develop, focus on its own development as and when as necessary, in cooperation rather than in conflict with other people. But we don't see that happening anytime soon, unless we get, the duopoly of the two parties on the system is broken in some way. It might be in the near future, but I don't see it happening as yet.
Yeah, and we're witnessing the decline of U.S. influence all over the world. I mean, you have the sort of the addition and expansion of BRICS. You've seen sort of blunders of our political class in the world stage not being taken seriously. And while we see this sort of decline of U.S. influence, we're actually, and it's not to contradict what you just said, but we're also seeing a rise in violence, and we have an increase in a tightening of sanctions, an expansion of a sanction regime. So is this just the nature of U.S. power, or is it a response or a consequence of the inherent contradictions of a declining sort of U.S. financial system?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is actually a very interesting question, and it does relate to some of the points in the earlier question as well. So basically, you pointed out earlier that the United States economy is very reliant on China. There's no doubt about it. So then why Are we making enemies of China? So earlier I pointed out that this is partly because, the US is hopping back. But, I would say that there is today a split in the US ruling class itself, in the US capitalist class itself. There are some elements that dearly want to increase tensions with China, want this proxy war against Russia to continue until, into a forever war and so on. While there are others, particularly vis-a-vis China, who don't want any such thing. And I would say that, to me, this was partly demonstrated by the fact that you had recently, I think it was just 2 or 3 years ago, that this Institute for Responsible Statecraft has emerged. It's not a particularly left-wing think tank, but it is basically saying that we should not be fighting all these wars. And I think that the fact that such a think tank can emerge, that it can find the sort of funding that it has and so on, shows that we do have a split within the US ruling class. Recent studies have also shown, there was also, perhaps it was published by this institute itself, that the overwhelming majority of the think tanks, the rivals of the Institute for Responsible Statecraft, who are advocating war with China, with Russia, etc., the overwhelming majority of them are very substantially funded by the military-industrial complex. So certainly the military-industrial complex has a great interest in continuing wars. And of course, in the last budget, all of them got big, fat, juicy contracts because, of course, all the weapons that are sent to Ukraine have to be replaced. New ones have to be manufactured. So they were really happy. And the budget itself not only had a lot of money going to Ukraine, but also a lot of additional money spending promised on the military front because, the world is becoming a dangerous place. We must spend more money in the military, etc. So you saw that happening. And so this military-industrial complex is a big major funder. But I would say that there are probably a couple of other sectors. There are, to me, there is the financial sector, which I would say is, would like to have more freedoms in China. But there are also big pharma and the ICT industry, both of which also see China as a competitor or as a copyright violator. So in that sense, they are also probably quite interested in at least trying to control China in some fashion, trying to and they probably live in some sort of fantasy world in which they think this is possible, even though the United States cannot even really control countries that are way smaller, a tenth the size of China. But nevertheless, these fantasies will continue as long as these corporations can fuel, fund think tanks that will spin out these webs and dreams.
So I have two final questions, and this relates to the question that I just asked in your answer. In your latest book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, which is just published this year, you take on a very daunting task of applying your geopolitical economic framework to a very different historical crisis, the novel coronavirus and the war in Ukraine. How are these two, briefly, this is the topic of your entire book, but how are these two related? And how did you go about synthesizing this argument?
That's really an interesting thing. So, first of all, let me say that the book began life as was simply entitled Coronavirus and Capitalism, or Capitalism and Coronavirus. And the reason for that is that, when the pandemic, when the pandemic struck, I was, I had just recently developed an agreement with a local left-wing journal called Canadian Dimension to send them a column a month. And my editor was saying, where's your column, So, and that was the weekend I had to write it. And of course, we'd just been sent home saying, don't come back, next week, we will do classes by Zoom. You will receive instructions on how to do it, blah, blah, etc. And of course, that weekend, I was puzzled by what was happening in the previous weeks. I had been examining how the Federal Reserve had been pumping absolute torrents of money into the financial markets, which were collapsing as the realization began to sink in that we were facing a pandemic and so on and so forth. So I have been watching all these things. And a couple of months before, in fact, I had been asked to give a talk on does capitalism have a future? It was a local group, but it's on the web somewhere. You can watch it. And I began that talk by saying the short answer is no. And then the rest of my talk, I explained why. So the point is that when the pandemic hit, my focus was definitely on the state of the Western economies in particular, and particularly the US economy and UK economies and so on. So the column I wrote at that weekend, which became which became the foundation of the book that followed. The column I wrote was essentially, it argued, it was entitled The Unexpected Reckoning. So I started by saying that, so in that column, I basically said that, capitalism has already been weakened by 40 years of neoliberalism. Now this pandemic has hit, and it is going to test sorely. It's going to weaken capitalism further. It's going to create a big crisis. And not only that, it's going to test sorely the coping mechanisms, by which I mean politics. That is to say, 40 years of neoliberalism have not only destroyed our economies, but it has also fractured our politics. It is, because at the end of the day, politics is the place where solutions have to emerge, right? But it looks as though even that is not going to be possible. So this became the foundation of the book. So for me, what unites coronavirus and war and capitalism is that 40 years of neoliberalism have so debilitated first world economies that they are losing ground to new challengers like China. They have become financialized, and therefore they have become productively enfeebled. And the coronavirus is going to put this to the test. And I was late in submitting my manuscript. And so when in February 2022, when the special military operations began and all that, I realized that the same problems that I am examining to show why the West has not been able to cope with what should have been a serious but manageable public health emergency, the same problems are also directly connected with why it is acting increasingly aggressively. So those are that's how the two things are linked. So in a certain sense, Nick, what I'm saying is that today, if the world is seen to have huge problems, the overwhelming majority of those problems are coming at it from that small part of the world, which we call poor capitalist countries. If the capitalism of these poor capitalist countries did not exist, if these countries were transformed into something else, the world would be practically instantaneously become a much better place. Because the rest of the world is also suffering from the imperialism where, you look at French West Africa, for example, today, or any other part of the world upon whom this Western capitalist world has imposed some of the most horrendous, excruciating, murderous economic policies, and for that matter, they have also conducted murderous wars. That's another matter altogether. But if this was not capitalist, I think we would be in a much better place.
I think that's a really kind of a great point at the sort of conclusion of this interview. And I just want to ask one final question. You can take us out on a high note. There's a quote that circulates often from his name is, I know how to say his first name, Brzezinski. He was one of the intellectual architects of the U.S. proxy war in Afghanistan. He says potentially the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances, end quote. Do you think it is fair to say that this dangerous, scenario has come true? Dangerous in quotes for the West, because Shoigu is currently in Tehran today making deals with Iranian military tech, while China is leading the way in creating an entirely different economic framework where, the sanctioned countries by the West can do business beyond the hand of the U.S. Treasury.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say that if China, Russia, and India came together, they would form an unbeatable trio. But yes, Iran is also important, and I agree that this is in fact, Brzezinski. Actually, if you read his book, The Grand Chessboard, you will find that he basically advocates the breakup of Russia. Because essentially the English as well as now the Americans, they have long felt that Russia is simply too big. What they mean by that is that if Russia was broken up into smaller countries, they would be more easy to manage and more easy to dominate, whereas Russia as a big country is much more difficult to dominate. But yes, I think that the alliance between Russia and China, this is the key alliance, is actually historic. It in many ways is undoing the damage of the Sino-Soviet split, which was very damaging to progressive forces around the world. And I would say that this alliance with China's human resources and Russia's resources and their commitment to a multipolar world, this is world changing, and I think that they will in the long run prevail. The only question is how much trouble will the West make before they prevail? This is how much damage has to be done. How much is the West going to kick and scream before it is finally dragged into this? And by the way, this kicking and screaming could easily entail a much bigger war, possibly even a planet-annihilating nuclear war. And I should also say that the longer the West continues to behave in this fashion, essentially uncooperative fashion, preventing international cooperation, in the name of democracy, which barely exists in Western countries today, the longer it does that, the longer we are going to fail to address the climate issue, which will also propel us in a planet-annihilating direction.
Well, thanks so much, Radhika, for joining us. I know you have to get on with your day, but is there a place where people can find your work? I know you do work on a podcast and a YouTube channel.
Oh, absolutely. So first of all, let me say that I meant to say this earlier, and I meant to ask you to say it at the beginning of this, but maybe you can tell people some other way. But basically, my US book, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, is free if you only want a PDF. You can download it, just search for it, and you can download it, I think, even from Amazon, certainly from the website of the publisher, which is Taylor and Francis. So please look for it, Radhika Desai, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War. My book, Geopolitical Economy, is also still in print, which you can purchase from Amazon or any other place for that matter, wherever you like to publish it. I'm not advertising Amazon. Don't particularly like it. The third thing I should say is, yes, I do. So my other writings can be accessed from my website, which is in fact being built, and also from my academia.edu page, where many of my things are available for free to download in full text. And finally, yes, I do a couple of things. First of all, I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group, and every month we put out a couple of really interesting webinars, rather, which I invite everyone to watch. We are easily found at www.internationalmanifesto.org. And finally, with Michael Hudson, I have been doing over this past year, every fortnight, a show called Geopolitical Economy Hour, in which we discuss exactly the sort of things we've been discussing today, but focusing on different themes in each show. So, and by the way, we also did 4 quite good interlinked shows on de-dollarization. So you maybe, those of you who are interested in that should also look us up. We are found on Geopolitical Economy Report, which is a website that Ben Morton runs. And that's the website that hosts, but we host the Geopolitical Economy Hour, and it's also, of course, found easily on YouTube. So, there.
And we'll put all this in the show notes. So thanks again.